I stopped the, okay, I need to restart the meeting.
It says it's a recurrent talk. Yep. I'm in. Let's see. I'm in. I was able to join.
You're in.
Yep. Now when we said
I'm working with it.
so these days we all have to be. I think.
Okay.
Okay. That they can't hear. There is no.
Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, Rascal made it.
How about now?
Works just fine. Sounds
Okay,
good.
good.
Okay.
Okay, we're resolving our technical difficulties. Now we just have to make sure we get all of the committee members located and we'll proceed. So please stand by. Sorry for the inconvenience. So for all you attendees that are watching for this coordination committee meeting, please stand by. We are absent 2 of the committee members. We need to find out their location, what their status is before we can proceed. So thank you for your patience. So Derek and Gus, just for you two in particular, even if we don't have a quorum of committee members, we're going to go ahead and likely proceed with the presentation for those that are present. So just stand by a few minutes longer, please.
Sure, no problem.
Probably we're approximately 4 weeks late, starting to harvest them. Now fine, with Steve, I think. Everybody in the great business is going to be nominated starting about now.
Good morning.
I made up your excuse that grapes are finally started a month late and there's no stopping it now.
No, I didn't say, yeah. Okay. I think that's all we're gonna get. Okay.
No, not yet.
Yep, we do. Let's proceed.
Okay, everyone. Apologize for the delay. We do have a quorum. Participation in the meeting, if you have some comments to say, please raise your hand on the Zoom platform. We tend to be fairly informal in this committee. We want to have as much dialogue as possible. I'll endeavor to make sure that we get you guys all heard, you both men and women, heard as often or as frequently as we like. Today is going to be primarily a discussion anyways. We don't have any action items in front of the committee. So, with that as a backdrop, I'll call the committee to order and note that we have committee members McIntyre, Grieva, and Wood present, and that committee member Kramers is AWOL.
Absent.
Oh, absent. Okay. I just added the without leave part. That's all.
And it's 10:18.
And it's
10:16.
10:16? 10:16. Are there any deletions or additions to the agenda?
We actually have Pledge of Allegiance here listed on the agenda.
I'm sorry.
We have Pledge of Allegiance.
Oh,
listed
did I
on the
just
agenda.
roll right over that?
No, it's not on yours. You have a different agenda.
It's not on my agenda, but if it's on yours, we can certainly do it.
Well, obviously, we're not doing this often enough that we would know.
Well, I
But,
printed this one out. I mean,
okay, well, we'll
no, it's
make
okay.
sure. No,
Let's
do it.
pause and we'll have a pledge of allegiance. Yeah, sure. Ready to begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all. Thanks, Brett. If I make any more mistakes on the agenda, please jump in.
I don't know if it's a mistake. We obviously need to get into our room for this meeting.
It's okay. So, we're at the public comment section. If there are comments from the public, I'd ask you to raise comment that aren't on the agenda, that's not on the agenda today. We'll have plenty of opportunity to chat about other things. Tom Berg from DWR, I saw you. I see your hand. Please proceed.
Okay, I am finally unmuted. Thank you. Thank you to the members of the committee. Again, I am Tom Berg with the Department of Water Resources, and I was just wanting to provide a brief introduction and information. I know it was already mentioned to the Salinas Valley GSA Board of Directors that I am no longer going to be the primary point of contact for the Salinas Valley group of basins. Mr. Bryce Massamora has been with our department over a year now, and he is going to become the point of contact for your basin, and his name will be the one listed on the DWR website when you or the public look to see who that person is. Amanda Peisch Derby will still continue on as the regional coordinator. Just to let you know, I will be continuing on as the primary person for technical support services in the Valley, and that's where my focus is changing to. But I did want to show up at this meeting, and Bryce is here also to learn about how the Aurora Seco GSA and the Salinas Valley GSA kind of fit together. And this is, I think, a great forum to see that in. If you have any questions, we're welcome to answer them.
Bryce, I don't see anybody jumping at that one, that question. So I'd just say thank you very much for the introduction to Bryce. Bryce, welcome aboard. We'll endeavor to make it as interesting as possible. I don't see any other public comment hands raised at this point, so I think we'll move on the agenda. Well, we do have one item of business, that is to consider approval of the May 2023,
Yeah.
our last meeting. It was held on the 5th,
On the 1st of May.
on the 1st of May, excuse me.
I move to approve. I'll second.
Motion been made by McIntyre, approved by Grieva for approval. All those in favor?
Aye.
So moved. Carried over. Done. Business. Okay, so we have a number of items for discussion, primarily for the committee today. Just want to reiterate, this is fairly high level on most of these. Some of them are going to be repeat items that we've been considering, like the annual report. But others are new, and I think at a staff level, working very well together, but we're not at a point where we're ready for releasing information to the public other than these kind of discussion points. So, kind of with that as a backdrop, Brett, do you want to introduce the first item?
Is that fine? So the first one is RCAs. That's another acronym that we absolutely love in Water World. Recommended corrective actions. And this is what DWR in their comment letter when they approved the GSP, the Groundwater Sustainability Plan for this basin, sub-basin, what they sent in as potential items to either consider or address or take into just do something with them. So like Curtis already mentioned, we have been working on both sides, pulled in because many of them are quite technical. So we included on both sides our technical arm, geology consultants, and we invited them here today, Derek Williams and Gus Yates, to kind of give you a high-level overview of what they are seeing in there is maybe more worth spending time and effort on addressing in the next round of GSP update. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Are you going to be able to share your screen, Derek and Gus?
I will. It looks like I can share my screen, so I will go ahead and do that if I can. Let's see there.
Yep, we see it.
You see it? Okay, good. So thank you very much. As Perrette pointed out, we're going to talk about recommended corrective actions. These were provided on the GSP, and they come from DWR. And this is as Curtis pointed out, this is going to be a very high level overview. We're just going to give you a high level view of where we're going with these. You can ask questions as you want, but we are just developing the plan right now, so there may be details we haven't put together. As you know, DWR approved the GSP for the 4-bay subbasin, and the letter that comes with the approval has 7 recommended corrective actions. Those are the RCAs there. Every approval letter gets recommended corrective actions, so don't feel like you were highlighted for any reason. And in fact, many of the recommended corrective actions in the 4-bay letter are very similar to actions requested in other subbasins in the Salinas Valley, the Upper Valley, the Langley area, all of those areas, the east side. They all have, most of them have very similar corrective actions. There's slight differences, but one of our ideas is we want to go forward with the corrective actions, take care of them, but in an integrated way also. Every subbasin is different. They have to deal with the corrective actions in their way, but we want also to make sure the corrective actions are dealt with in a way that it is coordinated across the valley there. Our plan is to address these 7 corrective actions prior to the 5-year GSP assessment, the required GSP assessment, which is in 2027 there. Some of these have a lead time that we have to start collecting data. So when I say we address them, at least we are starting to collect the data and have a plan on how we're addressing them by that 5-year assessment. So that's the overall view of what the recommended corrective actions are and what we're doing. Gus and I are going to step through each of the 7 corrective actions and give you our take on what we are planning on doing. This is our suggestions. It hasn't gone to either of the boards yet, but these are our suggestions on how the 2 GSAs might want to address each of the 7 corrective actions and make sure we're addressing them before the 5-year assessment. After each one, if you have any questions, please let me know so we can clarify anything we've said after each of the RCAs. I'm not sure I can see everything. So Curtis or Perrette, if someone raises their hand, please let me know. Thank you. The first one is to provide more information on groundwater level impacts to, and we say domestic well owners. You'll see that's in italics. It basically, the actual phrase is to all uses and users, but when we read between the lines, we believe that the main concern is make sure our groundwater level impacts are not impacting domestic well owners unreasonably. So that's going to be a lot of our focus. We did do some assessment in the GSPs, but what we're doing now, the GSAs are currently developing a valley-wide database to identify all the well owners and get better information about their wells, where they're located and how deep they are. And that's ongoing now. Once we get that database and understand where all the domestic wells are, where all the small system wells are, everything, then we can go back through the process we did for the GSP and say, now knowing where all those wells are and how deep they are, do we expect impacts on any of these wells, on any of the domestic wells? So addressing this in a fairly straightforward manner just takes time to develop the database of all the wells, and that's what we've already started on.
Thanks, Derek. I guess that pause is long enough to say, is there any questions or comments on the item?
That was it.
Yeah, I have
All right.
a quick question.
Yeah.
When we're gathering that information about all these wells and their depth, are
are we kind of also doing the altitude above sea level? So as we have these wells, we kind of know that if it's 100-foot deep well, but it's way up on a foothill or a bench, that could have a different effect. Just curious.
Yeah, that's a good point. It will have a different effect. So that is a good point. We will have the actual location, hopefully, of all of these wells. If the well log or the owner does not know the altitude of the well, we can probably get it fairly close just because we have the exact location. Hopefully, but you're right. Hopefully that information comes with the well log. I'll make a note of that, make sure we try and get that information. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other committee comments, questions? Public questions or comments on item 1? Okay, I'm not seeing any raised hands.
Good. I'm going to let Gus address some of the next ones on corrective actions. Gus, you want to take this one?
Sure. Several of the comments, 3 of them related to surface water, interconnected surface water and groundwater dependent ecosystems. One of their points was that DWR is working on a guidance document for how to address interconnected surface water. In many GSPs, the local agencies opted for a water level surrogate to infer percolation losses and gains along surface waterways. And DWR's really wanted some kind of stream gauging going on. So they're going to have a guidance document coming out. We have a hunch that it may not be appropriate for the Salinas Valley entirely. And that's because the Salinas River is managed in conjunction with the reservoirs for the purpose of losing a lot of water. In other areas, if you're losing a lot of water, that might be alarming and it would be a depletion of surface flow. In the case of the Salinas River, mostly that's exactly what's intended. So we're going to have to review their guidance document in the context of the Salinas Valley and pull out from it what's actually appropriate to our circumstances and see if we can run with that. We will also be installing shallow monitoring wells in riparian zones along the Salinas River and probably one along the lower Arroyo Seco, which was also part of their comment. If you go to the next slide, I'll cover the other 2 surface water GDE items and then stop for questions. One comment was to investigate the connection between shallow groundwater and the primary aquifers. We did mention that there was shallow groundwater and that might be different from primary aquifers. There's sort of confusion around what's actually shallow. So if you're a well owner, shallow might be a well that's only 200 feet deep. But if you're a plant, shallow means, something less than 30 feet. And so there's a data gap there, the way there is all over the state, for which we really need to be installing piezometers right in the river channel where the plants are to see what the true water table is in that habitat area and determine whether the plants are using groundwater. So we do have a plan to be installing several of those along the Salinas River in the forebay. Another comment was to map groundwater dependent ecosystems in the forebay subbasin. That makes sense to do as sort of a valley-wide effort, and that in fact is already underway. There's a program for which the Coastal Wetlands Group is taking the lead to do mapping of groundwater vegetation and to assess which they think are groundwater dependent throughout the valley. So that's in progress. Curtis is on that group. I'll be attending their next meeting on October 3rd to share some of my insights from the Arroyo Seco area. So I think that's also in progress and will be playing out soon. So well in advance of the GSP update. Any questions on these surface water connection items?
So Gus, before we go to questions of the committee, I thought it might be appropriate to kind of raise the same sort of issue relative to GDEs as you just raised in terms of surface water on the Salinas River. Here we've got a river system that is really managed, as you said, to percolate water into the groundwater basin, but it also creates a unique kind of riparian habitat that may not otherwise be there. And I think it's also appropriate to talk a little bit about that, the GDE interface with the Salinas River, like you did with the shallow, and surface water impact.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the reservoirs irrigate this corridor of vegetation that wouldn't otherwise be there. And so when conservation releases are discontinued for multiple years, then some of that vegetation dies. And we saw that play out during the last drought. My main concern is that this effort with the GDE mapping effort, apparently they aren't going to include the Salinas River channel, which is where most of the action is. So they were thinking that would be covered by the Habitat Conservation Plan. I'm concerned that the HCP is really going to be just focused on steelhead. So there might be a gap there, but I'll find out more when I go to that meeting next week.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, guys. I just think it's important to note that we have that similar issue, surface water and GEDs on a managed system that isn't strictly speaking, a natural waterway. It's being managed to
Right.
create those things.
Yes, exactly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Curtis, to build on that, my understanding, GDEs were separate from shallow groundwater areas, in so much as they're not connected to a river. Is that not the definition, or can they also be connected to a river?
They can be both, and the mapping effort that's underway is particularly looking at ones that aren't on the river. So there's the vegetation maps are starting with, as you'd expect, show lots of vegetation polygons along the river, but also off-channel ones that are sort of isolated wetlands or along tributary streams, and that's the ones they know they're going to focus on, and we'll see about what they're going to look at on the river. But the concept of GDE really applies to any vegetation where that can access the water table. It gets tricky. Most people think of wetlands, which are, shallow-rooted herbaceous vegetation where groundwater is actually discharging at the ground surface. But a broader concept includes certain species of oak tree that can have roots that are tens of feet deep, even 70 feet deep, and tap into a water table that deep. And does that make that a GDE? Potentially, yes, but it gets more difficult to map because it's harder to tell whether a given oak tree is using groundwater or not. Those are the challenges.
It seems to me, though, that there ought to be a differentiation between man-made GDEs and, let's say, you have an unlined ditch, right? And natural GDEs, because, boy, then we start to get into a real, weedy issue. So there isn't anything right now?
Yeah, the definitions don't make that distinction, but I think from a management standpoint, I completely agree that it's appropriate. When I was inventorying these off-channel GDEs for the Paso Robles Basin, a bunch of them were stock ponds, for example.
Right.
And so I said, well, I'm not counting that as a groundwater dependent ecosystem. It's just a pool of water and with no habitat value. So I scratched it off the list.
Right.
And there may be others. I know historically that's been an issue, say with vernal pools, where vernal pools vegetation would start sprouting entire ruts that were, we had compacted the soil enough to have long duration puddles, and you start getting vernal pool vegetation in the truck tire ruts. So, which isn't appropriate for management. So yeah, I think there's definitely a conversation to have about the different types of GDEs, what's man-made, what's artificial, what's natural, and how we're going to manage those potentially differently.
Thank you.
Any other committee questions or comments?
Yeah, no, I would encourage both of you up there to pursue that definition more before we go too far down the path. I think that's. Thank you.
How about public comment? Okay. Not seeing any raised hands. Go ahead. Proceed, gentlemen.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for the feedback on the GDEs. It is as Gus pointed out, there's a big gray area in there, and I think we do have a lot of opportunity to have some discussions as what our GDEs we want to say. So those were the first 4 RCAs. The last 3 are all related to groundwater quality. So they're all together here, and there are 3 somewhat related ones. The first one is to investigate how pumping affects groundwater quality. So we have a plan to take on a few things there. And that is, I will admit, the investigate how pumping affects groundwater quality is kind of a broad question. How do you address that? So we're going to be doing a couple things. And part of it is also getting a little clarification from DWR on a few things. But the first one is there are some data out there about groundwater quality and groundwater levels. And so we want to look at, is there anything in the historical data that tells us groundwater quality changes as groundwater levels change? Can we make any broad statements about that? And that's just to say, should groundwater levels change in the future? These are the quality trends that we expect to see. I doubt there will be that much information. It is actually difficult information to pull out and make a lot of good sense out of from a statistical or even a physical standpoint, but it is something we need to look at and make sure that we've addressed that to the degree we can. We want to include a discussion of salt loading from irrigation in this. This is something that the ASGSA had already performed. There was a decision. I will admit I probably drove that decision a little to not put it in the first GSP. It appears that was a mistake on my part. I will take credit for that mistake. We will start including that information, more information about the impacts, the salt impacts in the updated GSP. And the other thing is to investigate whether there are any remediation sites, any known plumes that existing pumping is impacting or not, or what changes in pumping might impact those plumes. There are probably not many in this subbasin, but it is another part of groundwater quality we need to look at and say, is anything we're doing, is any of our pumping impacting groundwater quality in a way that we need to address? So those are the 3 things we're looking at doing to answer that first question of how pumping affects groundwater quality. There was a second question about why we use 2019 groundwater quality data as a baseline. And we're looking back at this. There's a couple questions out there. I believe our 2019 data were more complete than our 2015 data, but this is just a fairly straightforward assessment. We're going to look back at the 2015 data instead of the 2019 groundwater quality data and say, if we use 2015 data, would we come up with any different sustainable management criteria? Would it change the way we're managing? I don't think it would. I think there's actually an advantage to using the 2019 data in that it identifies more constituents of concern. That said, we don't know it until we're going to look at it. We're just taking a straightforward approach to this one, addressing DWR's comment and then saying we will use whichever data we think are really the most protective of groundwater quality there. The final point is they want to relate pumping. This is similar to number 5. We want to relate the pumping to minimum threshold exceedances and undesirable results. These are groundwater quality minimum threshold exceedances and relate pumping to groundwater quality undesirable results. This one's a little vaguer, and we are going to get clarification, first of all, as to whether this only relates to groundwater quality. We believe so, but we need clarification on that. We have requested meetings from Amanda Peisch Derby, and I believe she is going to be inviting Bryce to this meeting also to clarify some of these issues before we take off on too much action on it. Make sure we're addressing the right questions they have, and we're not reading things into their questions that they don't intend. One thing, part of what we're trying to do is differentiate groundwater quality impacts from pre-Sigma pumping and post-Sigma pumping. And so, there's a lot of groundwater quality impacts throughout the state that are already in the groundwater. And the question is, how is our management impacting groundwater quality, not what was already in the basin? So we need to make that differentiation. And we also need to differentiate between what is just pumping going on or pumping that might be introduced as part of a GSP management action. So if we change pumping because it's part of a GSP management action, how does that affect groundwater quality? Clearly, that is something, if the GSAs say we must change our pumping and this is how we will do it, and it affects groundwater quality, that's clearly an impact. If we say we're not changing pumping and groundwater levels drop a long way, that could be an impact. If we say we're not changing pumping and groundwater levels stabilize where they have been for the last 15, 20 years, and there's a groundwater quality impact, the question is that really an impact or not? These are the types of questions we're working with, and we're going to be changing our SMC because DWR did say change the definition of undesirable results, and we are going to. We just need to clarify what an impact is and how we're going to change the SMC so that the GSAs are taking responsibility for groundwater management, but they aren't accepting responsibility for things that have occurred before they existed. So that's kind of a complicated one. Those are the 3 groundwater quality ones, and that's the end of the 7 RCAs. And are there any questions about the groundwater quality ones?
No, I'm not seeing anything from the committee members. How about the public? Okay, I'm not seeing any raised hands either. I think, Perrette, I think maybe we pull it back and you and I can talk maybe about what the next steps are. And Gus and Derek, thank you very much. You guys did a great job.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you on my behalf too. I've looked at those for many months now, and you made it so simple and easy to follow along. So I appreciate that. So
Right.
from Selena's GSA standpoint, as you know, we have more than one set of those. There are a lot of similarities. So we are doing similar exercise for the other subbasins. And then when we have them prepared, we'll bring it to our board. We have another subbasin. We have to run it with by another steering committee with Marina Coast GSA, just to make sure that we're on the same page, similarly to what we're doing here. But then when it goes to the board, what we would like to get from our board is just general, yes, it sounds reasonable where we're going with that. If we get that thumbs up, then the next step for us is to develop more of a schedule, scope, and budget. We've been talking about the 5-year update, GSP update. That seems to be practical milestone for us to target. But knowing that needs to be submitted in 2027, we'll probably start working on it 2025. There's some data collection efforts here. So that doesn't mean we have a whole lot of time. It means we need to turn around. What out of this becomes next year's work plan, that's to be determined. And I think that's something that I would like to bring back to this committee as it relates to this sub-basin GSP and RCAs. What do you think is appropriate to be carried out and implemented or starting the work next upcoming year's work plan? Because that drives the budget and that drives what gets paid out of the tiered fees that we have now. And or what is later on the agenda is the round 2 grant. There is some of that could be covered by the round 2 grant for this sub-basin. So I think we do want to make sure that the staff has very clear direction from the committee and the board. What is your vision of how we get this done?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just kind of summarize. I think what we need to, we got kind of a outline. We're maybe out in front of where we are in other subbasins. We have an idea where we want to go. We get some direction from both boards, and then we work towards scope and budget and implementation. It's going to take some time. It's not going to happen right away. Brett, I understand you have a lot more nuances in the various subbasins, and we need to work through all that. But that's all going to take some resources to accomplish, and we need to sort out that as well. So just stay tuned.
Question for either of you, but Fred, particular round two grant funding for this. You think it's feasible, and what's the timeline on that?
We don't have agreement yet. We just got a formal letter. I believe I would put it out, and we have Tom and Bryce there, and maybe they know that the magic date in the future. I would say it is typically it's retroactive to when we got the either application in or when we got the formal letter. So it goes back to July 1st, maybe of this year. And I would anticipate maybe 5 years from there. I'm just kind of throwing it out there that the round one ends spring of 2025. I would expect the round two, because it's 2 years later, to maybe be 2027. But yeah, the details are still, so it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, because we have not received from DWR a draft agreement yet, and that's where the specific scope, schedule, and budget is going to be per component and category. So I think, but the timing is good, because we are kind of working out what needs to be done, how we want to do it for this specific task, and then having the grant agreement and the details happening at the same time, we can ensure that there's alignment.
Okay.
And we'll be able to revisit this a little bit later in the meeting. We're going to talk about the round two grants.
That's true.
Yep.
That's it's good. It's good to put that on the table now, so we can start to kind of mentally wrestle with it.
Yep.
Any additional comments from the public? Okay. Well, I'm still thinking about that RCA acronym. I'm going to show my age here. When I first saw that acronym, I thought about the little brown and white dog that leans into the microphone, into the old record player. Right?
Close for just a second.
Yeah. Anyway, with that as a backdrop, let's move on to our second discussion item. That's the 2013 annual report. And so, Brett, I'm going to let you lead this one as well.
Okay, I'll lead it. So water year 2023, we have 3-4 more days left in that. I mean, this ends, that water year ends end of September here. And that was my first meeting with you, when the concern was raised that the process that Salinas GSA followed really was not maybe the best way to submit annual reports, and what can be done differently and improved in the future. So that's why I'm bringing it back up, that if this committee wants some, or the two GSAs, how do we work through that annual report that needs to be submitted to DWR that has very specific guidelines, what needs to be in the report. It is data driven. We are not going to be able to change that, nor do we want to change that. The data collection starts now, but because we, Salinas GSA, use the Water Resources Agency as the arm that collects the data, we're not in really driving that process. So we are scrambling at the end to get the tables and the data, and we kind of have to accept that. But what else is in the report? What else do we want to put in the report that maybe tells the story, that talks about the activities that are happening, the partnership we're doing, what are you doing out there, the users of this basin, that is worth highlighting and memorializing in that report. So how do we gather that? How do we get that out of you? Because I don't definitely have that, but I'd love to get some input.
I want to add a couple before, if we can. One of the struggles that we have organizationally is that we crafted this implementation agreement between organizations without really having, all the experience. And we don't have a ton of it, but we've got some experience now, and how the deadlines stack up when it was written. So it's an organizational thing. If you recall last year, what we did is, we were able to review at a staff level the narrative element, and I think that we want to definitely continue that. But the hard spot that we have is the agreement talks about an approval process, and your board doesn't even approve it. So we've got kind of an amendment kind of shaping up in the agreement might be the way to move forward. But we don't want to lose at least being part of the process to develop the report, especially given the kind of feedback that we've gotten from DWR relative to how important the narrative is. And the narrative is important to us as well. So I think that there's we can continue at least this year with having a staff-to-staff review of the narrative at a minimum, and then look to see if we can't improve in which the way we have it addressed in our implementation agreement. Because I know I've gotten pretty firm commitment from my board where they want to be able to see it. And as soon as it's available, I do send it to them. But again, your board isn't even approving it. So we need to sort that out. And we're going to push off to a future meeting. But for everyone's kind of consumption, the plan is to follow last year's approach for this year. That is to be at least have an opportunity to review the narrative before the thing gets all packaged together. Because I acknowledge, Perrette and staff are just crashing trying to get all the data from 6 different basins together, basins to throw them into reports and push it out the door. So so thank you for that.
I was just going to add that along those lines, the narrative did seem to be very important to everybody, and in particular, a narrative describing whether it's because the definitions of a wet year and a dry wet year were so confusing to a lot of stakeholders that there ought to be some narrative surrounding that description. So that was one I recall. The other is if we could coordinate the meeting schedule for the various implementation committees to review this prior to its deadline. I think if I recall last year, our meetings were after the deadline. And so people were concerned about not being able to at least read the report before it was issued to DWR. So again, knowing what deadline you guys are under collecting this data, getting 6 reports out, that could probably be 2 weeks before the deadline. And to impress upon the implementation committees that, hey, you're part of this process and you need to be Johnny on the spot and get this done. So we're not lingering or late.
Well, that's a really good point. I mean, the fact that, all the implementation subcommittees want to review it as well is like another step in the process. And it's, I think it's a daunting task when you start thinking about the timing of having the data available. Admittedly, a lot of it's in arrears,
right?
But still, your staff doesn't get it until, a few months, if that, before the thing's due. And you got all these reports and you've got people wanting to see it. So, I guess the intent in the implementation agreement between our two organizations is kind of a shared sentiment amongst all of the implementation subcommittees.
Right.
Everybody wants to see that, the narrative. So that's something that we as staff are going to have to work on to figure out.
You think Ara, under his leadership, I mean, he's really done well, I think, could help accelerate that. Have we spoken to him?
I know that he stretched thin with the resources agency, and then the bandwidth and staffing there is challenging.
Yeah.
I'm thinking what might be the best approach is not trying to bring a report in front of all of those committees, but take those sections or chapters that could be prepared. That we can start writing the narrative now. We don't wait for some data to come so we can, some of that, yes, you need to package, look at the levels, and then what's the story there. Mm-hmm. But in terms of what is done, what happened, what were the activities, that we actually start sharing those bits and pieces, because I'm also worried about if 2 weeks before the deadline, we are successful getting dozens and dozens of people together. What's also kind of questionable of getting forums of all of those ICs, not on the regular date, but a special meeting date. If there's a quorum and if they don't like something and actually make a recommendation, that needs to go to the board. They can't direct how it works. These committees are just advisory groups. They're not the final authority. They don't need to get but what they want to see is actually some change maybe. 2 weeks before the submittal, we're not making any changes into those. So those groups have to be okay then just receiving and getting more information, but not really getting input at that. So if we want input from all of you, that needs to happen much earlier. And that's why I'm thinking of maybe taking that report as it is and looking at the just, what pieces of that we're ready to start working on now. And then at least get the input piece with this and then just, yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, it's going to be a daunting challenge. I'm just thinking, as you mentioned, I was thinking about how you could actually staff those multiple meetings. I mean, they couldn't all occur on the same day. They're going to have to be some sort of scheduling. But the point is, a lot of people want to see that darn thing, and so we just need to think that through.
Yeah.
This might sound kind of crazy, but I'm thinking that this GSP is probably not the only one that is struggling with this same issue. And I know we have some people here from DWR, and I know that it's probably impossible to change any rules at that level, but it seems like extending that date would benefit all participants in all the groundwater basins here in California, because we want to do get the data out, and we want it to be right, and there's just absolutely hardly any time to check anything. And anyway, that's just my 2 bits.
Go ahead. Well, Michael, it's a good idea. As I recall, there was also talk about maybe being able to amend the reports, keep the deadline, but if there's broad changes, to be able to amend them by a certain date.
So I'm good. This is a good segue. One of the challenges that we have is that I think when we all first envisioned this annual report, it was primarily a data dump. By that, I mean, table after table after table of information that we've collected and, just made it available. But clearly everybody, DWR and our stakeholders, all want to have a say in terms of how that is framed,
Right.
how it's discussed, what's going on. Everybody wants more and more information. And it seems to me the thing that was considered in Sigma may have changed.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe having an amended process for submittal makes sense, especially if everyone is, and I think it's appropriate, everyone's focused on what does that narrative say? Because the data, you can pour over, but what are the trends? What are we doing about, each of our management actions and each of the various subbasins? What things are occupying the time of our staffs collectively? So, and that's all important information, both for our stakeholders, constituents, and DWR. So I'm not putting you on the spot, Bryce, but that's something for you to hear and to think about.
Also, when we're talking about crazy ideas, just thinking out loud, most of the reports for the subbasin are going to be the same. The data will be different, and there may be some different outcomes, but the context should be the same, shouldn't it?
No, I really think we're starting into implementation. Implementation takes us down a road where there are, I think, some fairly significant differences. Yeah. For instance, in the Forebay, we all approved a watershed protection plan for the Arroyo Seco River. That's not impacting anybody else.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm just, as an example.
I was trying to figure out a way we could do it all at once, but
well, let me ask Brett and Curtis, if a miracle happened and we got a permanent extension each year, how many more days would we need? I think it would be helpful if we had the narrative or were able to communicate with DWR that, would it be 60 days? If we had 60 days more, could this all not be so compressed? Or how many days would we need to do it right?
That's a fair question. We've identified a problem. What would we need? I would say 90 would be an appropriate, another quarter. As usually we're getting, I'm going to say collectively, we're getting the actual hard data pretty late in the year. Well, late in the term, February, Marchish, and it's due the 1st of April. So it is a challenge to put the whole thing together. And it would be nice to have a complete report that everybody could look at. We could get some input from our stakeholders before we submitted it. That would be a nice, but I think realistically, we're talking about another 3 months, 90 days. Given all of the touch points and committees and boards that we'd have to get it through. I just, Brett, do you have, does that
I
sound
would
reasonable?
say a quarter is maybe the least amount that makes any difference.
Yeah.
But also then we are almost into the next year, so we do need to be aggressive in getting this in. Another piece of that is what I'm just thinking is the data we're collecting, how likely, and mainly groundwater levels, I'm here thinking, how likely it is that any actions we took that year, or even the weather patterns, are impacting the groundwater levels the same year. Some upper zones, yes, lower zones, no. So is it okay that we kind of have almost that, this is raw data, we're gonna take a whole year, and then next year's report is actually gonna have an opinion on the actions.
Isn't that how we kind of are? Because, if you recall last year, by the time April rolled around, we had a pretty wet winter, and we started to see some really significant groundwater elevation changes, especially like here in the forebay. But we were reporting on
Right.
water year 2022,
Right.
which was still a drought.
Correct, but even the drought, at least the basin I worked before, and it was much deeper and maybe more layered there. We took 2, 3, sometimes 5 years to get to the deepest aquifer that's 1,000 feet down. If we had a wet year, we saw impacts 2, 3 years later. So the top one, not so much, but I mean, is there a way of taking, this is the data for water year 2023 that ends at the end of September in 2023. We did certain things also. We started maybe recharge project. We're not going to see the full effect of the recharge project that we started this water year, in this water year. So it's okay, the narratives are coming a little bit, or assessment of the management actions is going to come in the subsequent years. So the narrative is not going to disappear. We just have to be okay with, yes, we did something great this year, but we're not going to be able to assess how great it is or how well it worked this year. But it's because we know that reports are going to come every year. It's not like one opportunity to get this.
It's not every 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think you're right. I just say that, we're going to have a continuing opportunity to write that narrative in an appropriate fashion. And we've only got a couple of these things behind us now,
Yep.
and we are going to have
yeah.
a long time in front of us. So we need to think about how and what we're putting into the narrative on each year.
And if we
Agreed.
start with narrative now in October,
Sure.
we can have it done in a draft form by January. So have the 3 months to go and have everybody be like, oh, you forgot this, or what about that? But it's not linked up with the data that we're still waiting
Correct.
this year. So
That's-
if there's a way of kind of having those, it's like per system, right? The actuarial studies being done 3 years ago and the fees and, which is. But it kind of shows how the data collection takes so long, and then evaluation of that data, we need to be intentional and strategic. So we can't tell the stories in the same short time frame. That maybe there's a way of structuring it.
There may be an opportunity. I think it would be helpful for
Yeah, just-
us to have a
Yeah.
conversation with Abby and Derek.
Yeah.
I just checked it. I don't think he's around anymore, so I don't want to put him on the spot. We need to think about, what their thoughts are
Yeah.
to prepare it.
Yeah. So maybe kind of bring back some ideas of how, I think we have to also set expectations. That's one thing. If people's head is this report is going to do that and have that, and then they see after the fact when it's submitted, it was something different. So if we set expectations, and I think DWR is going to help us with that, because they are seeing lots of them, and they're probably seeing great ones and not so great ones.
Sure.
We might be able to get do more of that, this thing,
What we might consider doing is, developing the narrative for the previous year. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
And that would be helpful, so we're providing the data for the current year report that would end on the September prior to that April, but that the narrative might be about the year prior so that, you know, we can back it off a year
Yep.
and have some time to circulate it so that on come April, there's a narrative, may not match the data, but the data's in there and the narrative's there.
Yep.
That's certainly something we could consider doing.
Yeah, so it's almost like an amended previous report without amending it, which is providing more detail for
Sure.
the
Previous.
previous year.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, I'll talk to my team and kind of see what they think of that approach.
okay,
I do not want to create more work for them or for the staff. I mean,
no,
that's-
exactly.
But so how can we make that process more streamlined?
Yeah.
That it actually makes sense.
Given the interest that we have from our stakeholders, I think it would benefit everyone if we found a way in which we could vet like, just to your point, vet that narrative ahead of a crunch so that everybody knows what it's going to say and the expectations are met. As we all know, people's expectations are their realities.
I'm going to win the lottery.
Yeah. That might be your reality, but the lottery board has a different opinion. Okay. Any public input on the annual report discussion? I'm not seeing any hands. So, thank you, committee members. That was a good discussion. Thanks, Brett. Unfortunately, you got this one as well. The next one is to talk about where we are with
Fun stuff.
our fee and scope.
Fun stuff. So, I shared that with Selena's GSA board at their last meeting in September. And I just thought it might be of interest for you to know where we are. In June, when we did the two memos, there was a technical memo and a memo from Hansford Economic Consultants on the tiered fee structure, including the tables and the proposed fees for both tiers. In that memo, we received, the board received 8 items that were brought up by the stakeholders in various settings as when we were doing the outreach for the tiered fees. And we, at that time, the board was very adamant about this is important. Staff felt the same way. We gathered a lot of good information and we should do something with that. So when I started looking at it, those items, I was a little lost because there was a lot there and it was quite a bit of work. So I got a scope from Catherine Hansford, who has been doing the fee studies for the agency. And we looked at everything. We tried to quantify how much work would go into each of them, and not in terms of months or dollars at this point, but we just put stars on it. It's just 1 star or 3 stars. It says, yeah, it kind of requires legal review, or this legal piece is really extensive for that. Just kind of getting a sense of which ones are more media and which ones are maybe more administrative. So we have the table, and then we try to look at what is feasible in terms of, again, our process, when our budget gets approved and when the fees need to get approved, if we wanted to make any changes in this upcoming year. So we divided it up into 2 groupings, also in terms of what we felt was more important for stakeholders, what we heard more frequently, what impacted more sub-basin versus just one area. So staff came forward with a scope that was co-developed with a consultant of priority 1 group and priority 2 group, but those were loose groups. Our proposal was to take that to a joint meeting held by advisory committee and the board of directors to assess if those groupings are appropriate and make sense. But still, we were kind of advocating for there needs to be a phased approach. We're not going to be able to jump at all of them, get it all done. And so that's kind of where we are with the board, and no decision was made in terms of what items should be looked at right away. More importantly, what came up along with that is this is a work item that was not identified as a task when we did our work plan and budget in March and April. So there's no funding for that in our budget, current year's plan. And how our budget works is, as you know very well, if we have no fat, we have started to build reserves, but they are still very minimal. We just at the same meeting, the board authorized us to get 2 equity lines or lines of credit from a bank because our revenue comes in 2 times a year when property tax gets collected, and we have expenditures that occur throughout the year with our operating budget being 3.6 million. We're going to do the math, divided by 12 every month. How much goes out is 300,000. But there's 6 months before we get the first revenue in. So we don't have even reserves to tap into. So how we're gonna fund any portion of this work this year? That was kind of what really became that big question mark. The board directed me to go back and look at, is there anything that could be reallocated in that budget? Anything that could be not done? It was brought up, we had about a little over 200,000 in this year's budget to be funding, starting to put more money into reserves. That maybe this year we don't do it. Maybe we will put that towards this effort. The rough price tag was about 90,000 for the first phase that is payable to under that contract. And I was estimating another maybe 30,000 to support those efforts. Like if we need to do any technical assessment of the impact, like for example, one of them was extraction-based fees. We kind of really need to go and include other consultants. So 120,000. Where do we get that this year? So that's what staff is working on. We are bringing back to the board in October something that will be a solution. I don't know yet if I like that solution, if I would actually as a staff, recommend let's just completely deplete our reserves for an operating expenditure, but something the board asked me to kind of do that. So even with that, if we come up with some sort of funding scheme, and then the next thing is advisory committee and the board meeting, I'm hoping in October, I can get this meeting together. Again, this is we're talking about 40 people, trying to schedule 40 people to be in the room. And then those 40 people agree, or majority of them agreeing to these items are higher priority. Let's start looking at those. So if we walk away from that meeting and if we can start the work in November, I'm very concerned of having a fully baked through assessment of all of those components and how that now channels into actual fees. I mean, this is all great to think about. Well, yes, let's do extraction based. But we're not even having that. We don't have that data. We can't make that into fee the same year. But so I want to set the expectations. I guess, that's my kind of main message that I'm now telling everywhere. That even if we start this work right away, how likely it is that the fees, what the board might choose to adopt in June, are going to be very different from this year's. I think if we want to do it right, instead of jerking people, 1 year it's this, well, we have this now, let's do it that way the next year. I think having some consistency in planning and what people can, so I might suggest to my board to launch this process as a 2-year process. Don't expect any implementation happening this coming fiscal year. Also, what we don't have, what the board was very clear, giving staff direction, is that we are tracking this year's actual tiered cost, revenue, and expenses, and seeing how well they match up. By the time we need to submit the new budget in the draft budget in March, April to our board, I have only 6 months of full data of this year through December. Because as you know, invoices come the subsequent month, then it takes another month to pay them. I don't have even 9 months of data. I have only 6 months of data. So making an assessment based on 6 months of data, how well they're lining up, and trying to make changes based on that, I don't think it's a smart thing to do. So I think with all of you, and I know this committee also had very specific, we need to be looking at how this management area, revenue and expenses are they fair? Just asking for your patience. I think it's a marathon to get it right. The good thing is we are tracking, we're setting in place mechanisms that allow us to really look at on both sides, but we might not have a whole lot of information to base our decision this coming year.
I totally appreciate that. Just so you know, we're in for the long run, so recognize.
50 years, that's what Sigma has.
Oh, more than that, but it's, recognize it's going to take some time. Well, I think we're headed in the right direction. Any journey has to start with the first step.
Yeah, but what does go into that is what we talked about earlier. If there's anything that this committee feels we should be focusing in the next fiscal year that starts July of 2024. That needs to get into the work plan, that needs to get into the budget. So I think those are the things we need to be thinking about now. And then the tracking and the actual things itself. It's like almost the annual report. They're a little misaligned by the time a fiscal year starts, and we don't have the previous year's audited reports yet.
So I think our corrective actions and the ongoing programs are going to drive most of the budget items, but that's something we'll keep in the front part of our minds.
Yeah.
Any questions? Comments? Thank you for that. I know it's not easy. Public comment on the fee study process. Okay, so that concludes our discussion items. There's a staff report on our Grant 2 status.
That's a happy one.
Good.
The other ones have been, also very good ones, but not maybe as much, good news in there. This is a great one. So you probably have heard that already. Let me just pull up the announcement. That the application that Salinas GSA submitted for the Sustainable Groundwater Management SGM Round 2 Implementation Grant, mouthful, that we now we have a formal announcement out. We had an informal one earlier in the year that we received about half of what we asked. There were 32 groundwater basins in the state that received some funding out of the 187 million total. So out of the 187 million total, we received 10.3. I think it's pretty amazing. And that's so how that scope was written, because the first one, round 1 was all about 18400 being the critically overdrafted and critical condition. That's activities happening in support of that. This grant is for 4 sub-basins. So it's Upper Valley, Bay, East Side, and Langley. So that 10.3. And we asked for about 20. We received half of it. Also, Monterey, that's Marina Post submitted that application. They are receiving some funds. So collectively, this region was really noticed by DWR. And what needs to happen now next is we're going to look at the work plan components as we submitted. By and large, it's the Sigma compliance activities that got, so more filling data gaps, more monitoring, a few of the things that we talked about here, what needs to happen to address those RCAs. But we need to put more monitoring wells. We need to understand where the wells are, how deep they are. So I think some of that work, I'm thinking, could be done with that. There's a lot of money for outreach. And I think that's something that I could use help from all of the stakeholders. How do we reach the people that typically don't come to the board meetings, that they don't really know what's happening? How do we get their input, but also inform them all of the work that this agency is doing. So I think that I'm envisioning could be using a lot of kind of community bandwidth or really connecting the dots. Where are people? I mean, if you hear people saying things that, nobody's taking care of the groundwater, maybe bring them to me, those, or tell them, there's actually an agency. And I know we need to do a lot better because public agencies and our outreach programs, they're kind of boring. They are.
Well,
The way we talk
Not
about
if you're into
things,
water.
water is not. Water is so amazing, and but the way we talk about it is just, our board packets are really, who wants to read them? No one.
But I would say, consider your audience, 90% of the water in Salinas Valley is used by agriculture on average.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And you have a really good agricultural community that is participating in your implementation. So I think the message is getting out to the key stakeholders. Maybe where we could look at, different kinds of outreach would be in the urban areas.
Yeah.
That's
Facts, we do need disadvantaged communities. We do need to pay attention to that. They know what's going on. Small water systems, we're not quite hitting them as we're not getting active enrollment from them. But I'm also thinking there's a different way how we all communicate, These things didn't exist 10, 20, 30 years ago when
2007.
and they looked very different. So, and we know that the younger generation, if we're talking about our timeline is at least 50 years, none of us are going to be around. So we're doing this for around this table.
be somewhere.
We're not going to be driving the GSAs anymore. But are we preparing the next generation to really step in and continue what we are setting up the framework and structure? How do they communicate? Where do they get the information? Do they know we exist? They don't. So I'm kind of more of a thinking pictures, videos, because
reels.
it's amazing on Instagram, and we have Salinas GSA has Facebook and Insta account, and we just where I came from, Santa Margarita Groundwater Basin, they are going through a well monitoring well installation, and they've been doing push outreach for since inception. They put some heavy equipment on photo on Instagram, the likes tripled. So there's just certain things that people they see a big bulldozer. And but that's in that community. What are the things that this community gets excited about? What they would click on? What is just a little elevator pitch in there? People don't have time to read through all of the GSPs and that. Can we tell the story with just little bites that people go and share? Actually, do you know what I just learned? This is where I would like to be. That there's they get something out of this agency that actually gave them I didn't know it, but now I do because that I happened to see that. So I think that is the type of outreach I'm thinking I would like to do more of, where people actually go and talk about it and it goes viral. Wouldn't it be cool to be viral? It's a good thing. Viral is a good thing. Virus isn't, but viral is.
I'm looking around the table, and to your point, Brett, we're fairly senior folks, and we probably all share some common traits in terms of our style and the way in which we consume certain amounts of data, media, or whatever you call it. The folks that are younger than we are don't necessarily use the same approach. Mm-hmm. And, certainly continuing to think about how we can use technology for outreaches, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And it doesn't cost too much.
Yeah, that's true. I think where we might want to try, besides the DAPs, I think that's really important. But the whole Monterey subbasin, most people are clueless as what's happening there, and I don't know how we reach them.
I'm in that basin, and I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, me too.
So I guess that's my homework for us of you is just keep that in mind, that when you talk to different people, And maybe your kids, can just ask that question. Would you ever want to know about, what is being done about groundwater? How would you like to receive that? Would you sit to a board meeting where transparent because our board meetings are and committee meetings are public? I'm like, okay, that's bare minimum. But what would actually be their preferred choice of, is it a game? And everybody likes games these days. You make that, trivia.
Honestly, it's all about entertainment, but
It is.
it needs to have intent to be interested for some reason.
Right.
And sometimes the graphs and charts need it.
Hey, I'm a big fan of big yellow bulldozers
There you go.
and excavators, that always gets my attention.
There we go. So I think
I'm
those
here.
little nuggets, that would be the big ones that kind of like, you could try that.
Anything that has a wheel that's taller than me gets my attention.
Big wheels.
Big wheels.
You're not as old as you claim to be.
No,
Made out of stuff.
not at heart.
Yeah.
Anyways, so,
Yeah.
anything else that you wanted to mention on the grant?
No, but that will also fold into the work plan, and hopefully by that time we know what can be funded from here, what does help, this management area, because,
Yeah, so we have some ongoing.
Yeah, some state funding coming.
Comments? Public comment on Peret's report? Okay, our last item, because I'm not seeing any, our last item is future items, and we kind of mentioned it a couple of times. Brett and I have had a couple of discussions. For instance, this meeting really, by virtue of our implementation agreement, ought to have been in Salinas, because we're supposed to alternate. And, we may not be hitting all of the fine points of the agreement. We had a long discussion about the annual report. So what we're proposing is maybe in our next meeting, we kind of unpack some of that and have a discussion about what we might want to see in terms of an amendment to the agreement that makes it a little bit more streamlined for us to operate a little easier. And that meeting will be in Salinas. And when we get it scheduled, that'll be one of our principal items.
Mhm.
Does that make sense to you all?
Sure.
And maybe the annual report narrative, gonna keep bringing that back. Maybe we can have something for review,
Perhaps, yeah, okay.
see how that
I
goes.
wanted to put that one on the table first, because we've had a couple of discussions, and like I mentioned, when we crafted the thing, we were in a different headspace than we are today. Not that we're all gonna,
I wasn't even here.
yeah, you weren't even here, but we're not gonna make wholesale changes, because the structure still needs to.
disclaimer, I can hear it.
I didn't do it. I did not do it.
Not my fault, yeah. Well, I was here, and I can tell you that a lot of it in there is great.
Yeah.
Anyways, so all kidding aside, there are always ways to improve things,
Yeah.
and we can make some improvements soon. So, any public comment on future items? Seeing none, I think that brings us to an adjournment.
Very nice.
11:30.
Man.
Oh, yeah.
Indeed.
Thank you, public. So big yellow wheels and being on time.
Excellent.
Really?
As long as I don't have to hear about your truth. Okay, that drives me nuts, I guess that tells you how old we are, right? Truth is truth. But nowadays it's like, oh, well, my truth. It's,
That's right.
yeah,
That's right.
my truth. And then that actually gives you permission to lie, right? After that point, as soon as you say that, that's it.
The next line is on. Great. See you guys later.
Oh, thank you.
It's the screens that are built into the phone, to the camera, that they can pick up the everything from when you talk to them.
Yeah.